nationwide. It's mostly directed by program leaders, and we've also had really excellent support by the rural development centers across the country. I can't talk and switch the slides. Here you can see kind of where our team is located. So we're in all 4 regions of the U.S., and we have folks that represent those regions. We've put on workshops at NACDEP, at Community Development Society for the program leaders, both nationally and regionally. And we started this webinar series. So we're really excited today to have, is this the 5th maybe installment, 6th installment in our webinar series? Briefly, these are some things that we're trying to do as a team. We really want to help influence extension directors nationally to really collect and put these indicators into their state reporting systems. Meredith Weinstein's here from North Carolina, and just this week we got these put into North Carolina systems, so I'm really excited to see this change happen, and it takes a long time. We want to focus on really improving evaluation, and that's part of what this webinar series is trying to do, is improve evaluation nationally. Community development's a tough thing to evaluate. It's hard to just look and recognize and quantify or even qualify what you're trying to see. So we're trying to develop tools, communicate tools, educate on tools to do that very thing nationally. We really want to help get to really the key indicators, what we're doing in community development. So we're always revisiting, saying, do we have the right indicators? Does this really capture what we're doing? We want to focus on public value that extension brings through this work, because we believe that it's not necessarily a private value, but it's a public value, and it's something that needs to be supported by the public system. And it's really important to our communities and adds a lot of value that lives far beyond the day into the future, and increase our kind of national dialogue to do this work. So today I want to introduce our speakers. We have 2 really exciting speakers with us today. So the first is Marianne Durland. She's an independent evaluation consultant and a leader in the use of social network analysis for program evaluation. Dr. Durland is one of the original organizers and the current chair of American Evaluation Association's Social Network Analysis Topical Interest Group, which is hard to say, and is co-editor of a special issue of American Evaluation Association's New Directions and Evaluation Journal that's focused on social network analysis. Dr. Durland specializes in mixed methods and models and applications of social network analysis and evaluation. And she's currently writing the Handbook of Social Network Analysis and Evaluation. We're really excited to have Dr. Durland with us here today. And for those who've attended many of these webinars before, you'll recognize our second speaker is Dr. Scott Chasden. Scott Chasden is an evaluation and research specialist for the Extension Center for Community Vitality at the University of Minnesota. In his work with Extension, Dr. Chasden has gained expertise in innovative methods for measuring social capital creation and other community development outcomes. He earned his PhD in sociology from the University of Denver and a Master's of Arts in Cultural Anthropology from the University of Florida. So thank you so much for our speakers. We'll be taking questions in the chat box below. So you can write your questions in the chat, and we'll try to make sure all those get answered. And enjoy the webinar.
Hi, this is Marianne Durland. Can everybody hear? Scott, you're also on, and our session is, I have not had sound until just now when you said we're beginning. So if I've missed anything important, here we go. So this is social network analysis for the uninitiated. What is it and what is it good for? And we have a table of contents. We're going to cover 3 topics. What is social network analysis? What can networks tell us about people the organizations we work with, and relationships between people and between organizations. And then how do you do social network analysis? What is it? Social network analysis is a methodology. It's a set of tools and theories, just like we have with quantitative and qualitative methodologies. And its purpose is to study the relationships or connections between and among entities, any kind of entities. And what you get when you have this data is a graphic view of a network, and you have analysis of the data. So you get two things. A network is made up of what we call nodes. Nodes are the entities. They can be people, streets.
Uh-oh, you're cutting out. Maybe Marianne, are you able to come back in, or I'll just keep going with hopes that she can get back in here. This is Scott Chaston. Networks are made up of the nodes, which can be people, organizations, ideas, and then the connections, which are depicted in these network diagrams as the lines that connect those nodes. And relationships, you can, when you're doing this kind of research, you can focus on all kinds of relationships. So when you draw these lines, the lines can mean a lot of different things. It could be a relationship of working with someone, etc., and relationships of trust. So this particular slide, and I'm just kind of jumping in because these are Marianne's slides, but this particular slide talks about all the different roles and responsibilities that one could explore doing a network analysis. So it could be about information sharing or drafting things together, presenting together. Any of these activities on the far right-hand side could be activities that you focus on when you do a study of relationships using social network analysis. So there's all sorts of possibilities of things you can explore more deeply. And as you'll see in our examples, we go into quite a few of these different kinds of relationships and different kinds of ways people and organizations can be connected with each other. So here, here we have some examples of what social network analysis produces, and these images are called sociograms, where the nodes, as we've described, are represented as circles here, and you can use color, you can use different shapes to represent the nodes. The lines or connections are flexible, and that you can adjust the thickness of lines depending on the strength of a relationship. And it's interesting to look at that line thickness as well as where lines exist and where they do not. And we'll be talking a lot more about, for example, are you back?
Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm back. Yeah,
yes.
It just keeps going in and out. I'm not sure. But this is an example of two different kinds of relationships on that same network. And so the relationships are different and the interactions are different. And so we can see that not every relationship is going to be exactly like another relationship. And you can measure them separately, or you can put them together and see what an overall big pattern of relationships looks like. Thank you, Scott, very much. SNA data is matrix data, which means that it forms a matrix, and you use matrix algebra or graph theory to analyze it. So on here, we can see that person AA selected EE and OO. And what will happen is when we look at a graph or a sociogram, that's what we're going to see, AE, AA, and OO. That person is connected. My mouse is, I'm running my mouse as I'm doing this, and I realize you probably are not seeing the mouse. But the measures then are on each of these connections. And there's really only one measure that is a direct connection, and that's in and out degree. How many people picked me? How many people did I pick? Other than that, it is graph theory and matrix algebra for the measurements, which we're not going to talk a lot about today. Here we have just a little sociogram and some of the things that are important about sociograms. The shapes, as we said, are called nodes, and you can make them different colors and sizes and so on. Again, the relationship. And then we have the arrows indicate the direction. So 18 chose 19, and 34 chose 19. 19 didn't really, or 39 didn't really make any choices as far as I can see here, as there are no arrows going from 39 to anyone. So those are things that we look at. Not an isolate, just a person who didn't respond. Now you can measure a lot of characteristics, components. Does it hold together, or does that network break apart? The density, which is how many connections out of the possible you have. And that's a relative term, because if you have 5,000 people, you don't expect all 5,000 to know each other. If you have 10, the density should be a little higher. Centralization is if somebody dominates the network, and that helps us to understand what might come up in other measures, that we should be either looking for someone who's dominating or not. And then we have the cliques and clusters. Cliques are a very specific way of saying 3 people minimum talk to each other and there's nobody else around them. They are definitely all connected. Clusters are different ways of measuring. So you have cliques which are real strict all the way to other kinds of clusters that are very loose and have different ways of acting. So what can networks tell us? They can tell us about interpersonal relationships. If this were a classroom, who do you want to sit by? If this were an advice network, who do you go to for advice? If this were, who do you walk to school with? Who do you plan meetings with? Who are you on a committee with? This is interpersonal, a little bit smaller and a little bit more. You'd expect everyone to be connected in some way, and if they're not, then that's what you would want to build on or explore. So here we have, everybody has connections to them except 18 and 66. They have, 66 has one connection coming to them, and 18 does not have any. So we kind of wonder, are they new? What's happening? What kind of relationships are going on here? That would direct some of our understanding of that network and the questions we would ask. So just as we have data, we also have questions when we look at our sociograms to begin with. I always emphasize looking at the sociogram before you do any data analysis. They work hand in hand. Here we have an organization with multiple people and offices across the world. This could be across a city, across a county, across a state, and how do they communicate with each other? And we can see here that there is that center little green group that appears to be different from the little green group that's over in the right-hand corner. So they look like they sort of connect a lot of the orange and the white and maybe a little of the blue together. We don't see any direct connections between the blues and the whites and the reds and the pinks. So that tells us, why is communication not happening there? Or is it happening through that one little orange node that's kind of in the middle there? Is that the connection hub? And are they connected into that? And is that what keeps communication going? So if you want strong communication, you might want to be looking at, oh, do we have multiple hubs? Do we have multiple ways that people are communicating? And is it all working for everyone? If anybody has any questions, just holler. This is a leadership network, and it's a two-mode network. Normally we use one mode. This is traditional data in the sense that if you asked 1,000 people, here are the leaders of our company or people who provide workshops, which ones would you go to support your organization? And so we see that each of the little boxes might be a person or a company, a vendor, and all of those little round ones are the ones that would use them. They would go to them, and they would be the ones who would want to, they would choose as a vendor or a leader or a professional development person, or it might be an area of study, but it is it's called two-mode because we have the boxes, which are the things to be selected, and the circles who are making choices. You can change a one mode into a two mode into a one mode. So if you were to look at those little ones over on the right-hand side, those two that stick out, if you were to do a one mode, they would all be connected together, yes, because they are connected to the same leader. And so they would form a little clique, and then they'd be connected to that other one that's sitting out there, and then that person would be connected to all the ones who are connected to, right. So they all would all get connected in some visual way. And thankfully the programs do that for us, but we could already see where there would be mutual connections within each of these little clusters.
Marion, you can move that arrow around as you want to. Now that I've got it up for you, just move it with your mouse if you want to point to something.
Oh, I love it. Thank you. Yay. Okay, here we go. So this is information sharing and subsets. It's a way to take a map and to highlight mutual ties. So we saw on the underlying map, which is put in the background, that there's a lot of ties going on. But when we bolded the lines, we were able to see where the mutual ties are. So are these different teams working within an organization, and are all the colors the different projects they're working on? And so when you look at this orange one here, they're very highly connected. And you have this green one right here that's very highly connected also. You have these green ones, which are somewhat connected, but yet they're also missing connections to the majority of their team. Over here we can see we have the red and the purple, highly connected, and we see this one yellow one in the middle. These happen to be organizers, and so they should be spread throughout. And this one is connected to some of the teams, but because they were just starting, as time goes on, you would want these yellow ones more integrated and more of the teams connected to each other, as well as within the team. So there are things you can find out, and there will also be measures for these. What percentage of mutuals there are, we'll do measures. You can find out clicks, because any of these that are 3 that are all mutual, that's going to be a click. So click measures are going to be interesting. Mutual measures will be interesting. And being able to plot connectors between, like this little green one up here on here is going to be a connector to this one and these here through that, and then also to these up here who are not connected to each other. So that's going to be an important focal point, who that is, their role in the community, and so on. Okay, Scott?
So I have some examples here of using network analysis to explore change over time in a network. I recently helped evaluate this 12-state North Central region water network. And we looked at connections among individual extension people in the 12 states, but we could also aggregate from the data on individuals to the state level. And we could focus on particular issues. So here we did a pre-survey in May of 2014 and looked at the level of connection among people in the 12 states. Let's see, I don't know what happened to my screen, which is unfortunate. Okay, we looked at the level of connections among people in the 12 states back in 2014, and we saw in this case that there weren't lines connecting, there weren't relationships among extension staff in among all of the states, a very disconnected web, you could say. And a density is a good measure. That's basically the number of connections that are there, the number of lines that are there, divided by the total number of possible lines, all the possible connections among the 12 states. And so it was a density of 37%. And when we did the follow-up survey just recently in June, we saw a large increase in connections among people in nutrient and manure management, and much stronger connections. The thickness of the lines means there were multiple connections among people. For example, between Ohio and Indiana, there were multiple connections going on back and forth between those two states. So this is a very nice way to show progress in a network, and in this case, an evaluation of a 12-state network that was supposed to be building networks among educators in 12 states doing work to promote water quality and quantity. So the next slide is another example that I've used of looking at change over time, and this was from a leadership program in Morocco that was run by University of Minnesota Extension. And here we had 3 different points in time where we collected data from the participants in the program who each represented a farmer cooperative in Morocco. And so here we're looking at connections among these farmer cooperatives. And a core goal of the program was to strengthen connections among these cooperatives. So here at the baseline, we had a density of 20%. At the end of the program, the density was up to 51%. And then we did a 1-year post-program follow-up last February, and the density had continued to grow. So the relationships and connections among these farmer associations in Morocco has been directly impacted by the extension program in that country. Another example here is where we looked at shared connections among departmental units. So years ago, we did a study in Minnesota looking at Extension's outreach networks, and this got published in the Journal of Extension. It's called Mapping Extension's Networks. And one of the things we learned there is that all these red dots on the screen are organizations external to Extension, specific organizations in the state that are not a part of the university. And by looking at the different program areas in Extension and who's connecting to the same organizations, we're able to learn so much about ways that some parts of Extension are sharing common audiences with each other, and maybe or maybe not knowing that. So does the right hand know what the left hand is doing in an organization as large and complex as Extension? And for example, we learned that our own community economics program in community development, community vitality, shares some common audiences with farm financial management. Probably not a huge surprise, but maybe that means we need to be talking with each other more and making sure we're sharing information about the audiences that we have in common. Okay, I'll turn it back over to Marianne. You may have to unmute.
She's having trouble with her sound again, Scott, so you may need to
Oh.
just out a little bit.
Well, these I can't actually speak to these particular slides because these are her examples coming up. So maybe I will just skip to more examples that I know about, and then we'll go back to her examples. So I will come right back to here. Although in this case, I might just be able to say this was an interesting comparison that she has, comparing two different organizations. And it's so interesting when you discover, for example, in the organization on the left, that your organization head was not actually identified as being a central player in the network, in this particular network analysis. Whereas in the organization on the right, the organization department head is right smack in the middle where you would hope the organization head would be. So as she notes here, two organizations almost identical in terms of size and client demographics, but with very different structures about how information flows within the organization. And maybe when Marianne gets back on, she'll want to talk more about this example. So some of the applications of social network analysis, we've started to talk about them. You can really look at team functioning, how communications happen among members of an organization or between organizations, and what are those patterns and what are the pathways of information flow. And this can really help you if you're working to develop the organization or develop the network among organizations. You can start to see patterns. You can locate leaders. Sometimes those leaders are not the people you'd expect in an organization, or sometimes the people who have most access to information are not the department heads. They might be the secretary in the department, for example, where information tends to flow. And you can look at frequency of communication among different individuals or organizations. And really, who are in those key roles? We're going to come around to how the data are collected. That's the next part of our presentation.
Okay. Great.
So, I'm going to just go to the next slide here. You can also identify gaps in communication, which can really, really strengthen an organization's ability to implement programs and policies. Gaps in structure that are impeding an organization from moving forward or an initiative from moving forward. That idea of finding out who the isolates are, that's super important. If there are people or organizations that should be part of a network and are not, this method can allow you to find them. And also where there are these key nodes, the facilitators or the gatekeepers that information tends to flow through. That can be great. It can be great to have individuals who are these storehouses of connections. But if that individual is gone from a system, then you have a total chaos because there's no way for information to flow. So it's nice to have multiple points of connectivity in a network. A few organizations or individuals who are all important in the network. Are you back, Marianne? Okay. I'm going to just move on to how do you do it, because that was where you guys were wanting to go. And so there's a sort of step process here to doing an SNA. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to collect the data. And once you've collected your data, which is usually collected with some sort of survey, it can either be a survey or increasingly people are using existing social media platforms also as a way to collect network analysis data. So you can use Facebook groups and you can suck the data right out of Facebook groups if that's appropriate to look at characteristics of a network of people who might be using that group. But typically you're developing a social network analysis survey. And then you can start looking at the sociograms to really, as Marianne mentioned, start asking questions about the network. And you can run lots of cool metrics and do data analysis and refine your sociograms to better communicate to your audience what it is you want them to notice about the network. So we're going to show you some examples of of how we've gone through this process. I mentioned this Morocco survey, and this is in French, which is kind of interesting. But this was basically a survey of the members of these farmer associations. So the farmer associations, and this is basically from a Qualtrics survey, or it wasn't Qualtrics, it was a paper survey. And so there were a list of these farmer associations in that left-hand column, and then we were asking them, during the past 12 months, how frequently did they have contact with people from these other farmer associations? And so there's basically a response scale of never all the way to weekly. And so people go through and fill out the survey indicating how often they had contact with members of these other farmer surveys. This is what we'd call a one-mode kind of question, where you've listed for everybody all the possible nodes, all the organizations that are in the network, and you're asking all the organizations to answer some question about their connection to all the other organizations, so that both the people receiving the survey and the people listed in the survey, or organizations listed in the survey, are the same. Then you can do this kind of also two-mode survey, where in this case we asked people in organizations across Minnesota to list the organizations that they worked with to influence rural practice or rural policy. And essentially they just typed in a list of we limited the number they could type in, I think, to 30 organizations. So people typed in the list of organizations. They were given a lot of instructions beforehand. And then for each of the organization that they typed in, they were asked a question in this matrix about if you shared resources with this organization and if you collaborated with this organization. And that's called the two-mode analysis because people are actually typing in the names of the organizations. So it creates a very different kind of network diagram, as you've seen some examples, and I will probably show you some more as we go forward. This particular survey was done using Qualtrics, so this was an online survey. Marianne, are you back? Okay. I'll just keep going. So the software needed to pull this off, social network analysis, if you're going to use online surveys, you need online survey software. You need Microsoft Excel because you dump the data out of the survey software into Microsoft Excel. Then you have to format the data to put it into one of those matrix formats that you saw earlier. And that matrix format, once you've got the data formatted that way, then you can bring it into an SNA software package. And the sort of one that's been around the longest is called UCINet. We have, between Marianne and I, we've used other ones. I've used one called Node Excel, which actually doesn't require a matrix format, but it's a very different sort of data interface than UCINet. But they both work fine, and I learned, literally, I learned this from a colleague. I did not take any special classes. I just kind of learned it from a colleague who got me started. Although most universities will have classes about social network analysis, often in their sociology departments. The graphics software is built in. It's called NetDraw, and that's actually built into the UCINet program package. UCINet is not expensive. I haven't checked, but I don't think it's more than $100 to purchase the software. And Node Excel has a free version, but as is true of many free softwares, you want to get the professional version because it does more stuff, and that's probably about $100 as well. So we're going to show you some of our favorite examples and then hopefully have some time for questions. And this is where I really wish Marianne could chime in, because some of these are her examples and she would have great things to say about them. But this, so I think what I might do is just skip these and just go to my examples here, because I don't know what exactly she wanted to focus on these. So one of my fun projects recently was looking at years of a leadership program, and there have been multiple cohorts of this leadership program over the years, and the organization wanted to know, well, so what? We've got years and years and years of having this leadership program. How is this program having an impact? Well, one of the ways we looked at this was the actual networks among alumni of different cohorts of this program. And so we did this big social network analysis of all, I think there were 200 plus alumni over the years. And so these diagrams show each cohort is a different color, and if you kind of read across and then go down to the bottom row, and there were actually more data even than this, you can start to see that the people develop these strong relationships within their cohorts, but then there were all these kind of relationships across cohorts. And then down when we get to the lower right corner, they added a cohort, because until then they had just been in the Twin Cities metro area. Then they added a cohort in Fargo-Moorhead, and that cohort had tight connectivity among itself, but there were some key connectors, key nodes that were connecting the Fargo-Moorhead group to the Twin Cities group of alumni. And so this was a really fascinating thing for them to really start to unpack the impact of this. This was not done, yes, I'm sorry, this was done retrospectively, Lori's question. So we basically had a list of all the alumni over all the years, and we sent them all this online survey. And in the survey was a list of all the alumni and a question basically of what kind of relationship they now had with each of those people. So it was a bit of a bear to fill out, but we kind of gave people a lot of warning about it. This was this mapping extensions networks study that was published in the Journal of Extension. And so in this case, you can see the squares are the extension programs in Minnesota, and you might not be able to read them all that well, but the blue ones are agriculture and natural resources, the yellow ones are family development, the green ones are youth development, the orange ones are community vitality. And the red dots are the organizations outside of extension that those program areas were connected to. And so what you start to see is this, well, the health and nutrition is this clump in the lower left, SNAP education. They have their own network of organizations they're connected with not a lot of overlap with other extension programs. But you can see that there's a lot of strong overlap between community vitality and food, ag, and natural resources, and the dean's office. The black square in the middle is the central extension. And a little bit of a concerning river that we call the network division between these worlds that we're working in. On youth and family on one side of that river, community vitality and food, ag, and natural resources on the other side of that river. And at the time we thought that was kind of concerning, that there may be more common outreach that we could be doing and connecting across extension. So is Marianne back with us yet? Because I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, because I would really love for her to be able to speak to some of these slides that she's got here that were her favorites. One thing I'm noticing about her slides is that you see these little floating nodes. So whenever you see these floating nodes in diagrams like this one and this one on the left, those are nodes that are not connected at all as part of the network. Those are outliers. So that's an important thing to pay attention to in network analysis. And this particular network is very dense, very many, lots and lots of connections. Although you can see there's clearly the sort of gray square group, which she could probably speak to who that is, versus the white circle group. Just want to mention before we have some time for Q&A is that we do have our, just the other day, came up with our next webinar for our series, of which this is part. And that is called Documenting Community Outcomes with Surveys. So if this is going to be a good overview for how to design surveys and create surveys to get at community development outcomes. And that's going to be on Monday, February 6th at 1:00 p.m. Central Time. So another question I'm seeing in the chat, does the software determine where the nodes are placed in the sociogram? Yes, there's all sorts of mathematics going on in the software that determines where nodes are placed, but it's always based on the connection that those nodes have to each other. So, and the common connections that nodes have with each other. So things that tend to be more central in a sociogram tend to be the nodes that are the most strongly connected or have connections to the most sort of diverse other nodes in the network. There are, with the softwares, there are a range of options for ways to draw things, and you can also move things around yourself manually once the software draws it for you. But there is a certain benefit to having the software do it because it shows you a sort of mathematically derived way of understanding what's the most central and what's on the periphery. Can you show an example of how you organized your data in an Excel matrix? So if I go way back to the beginning of the PowerPoint, I'm just going to do that. So this is a matrix for a one mode. In other words, that first column there, all those are the same people in the same order as this second row. So basically, that first cell where it says AA and AA, that's person AA's connection with him or herself. And so usually that's a 0 or blank. But if you read across, those are all of person AA's connections to all of the other members of that network. So if you were doing a survey and you had a list of, let's say, I have a dozen people in my work group. In the survey, those dozen people would be listed in a table, and I'd be asking you, tell me about your connection to each of these people in your work group. And you would, in your survey, you would put them in the same order. And when you get the data dumped out of your survey software, you'd organize the responses in the same order that they appear actually in the survey. to create a matrix that looks like this. I hope that answers your question. With a two-mode survey, you don't have to have a setup quite like this, because in a two-mode survey, each row of data is a survey response, and each column is a node that person reported a connection to. But it does not have to be reciprocal in a two-mode. It isn't reciprocal in a two-mode analysis.
And
Can you give an
isn't
example
reciprocal in a one mode either. I'm back.
Marianne is
in a one
back.
mode, it does not have to. I'm back. In a one mode, it doesn't have to be reciprocal either.
Right, it can be. So, right,
can
in a one mode, it can be reciprocal, but it isn't necessarily.
Right. Were you talking about one mode and two mode data?
Yeah, but I'd like you to, if you have a chance, to talk about some of your favorite sociograms, Marianne.
Okay.
We can go.
Okay.
There.
Yeah, there we go. This was not it might have been the complete network, but the nodes are much larger than they would normally have been. This was an evaluation of an organization that had two organizations that had worked together before, did the same kinds of work, and then merged. And 6 months later, they wanted to see how well they had merged. And this is the overall network, and when I ran the sociogram, I tweaked it a little bit just so you could see that division a bit more. Sociograms, I saw a note that somebody had posted you can set them to certain parameters. And you can make a circle one, so that if you wanted to compare 3 or 4 different organizations and so on, and you can tweak them a little bit. But generally, the sociogram, I run it on a pattern of make the lines not equal. Don't make them equal. Any nodes that are close together, it's multi-dimensional scaling. Pull them over to the side that they belong on. If they're not connected together, pull them to the other side. Reduce as many overlaps as possible, and then lay it out. And then you kind of move a few around to see them better. So as we can see, they did not merge very well at all. And when we looked at the 2 organizations, there were actually 2 huge cliques, one in each organization that controlled each organization. Now the next slide is a slide of the first, second, and third choices. So this was value data about who do you work with, first, second, and third, and then who do you work with on any projects in 6 months. And here we have the first, second, and third choices that people made. Some people were not even chosen. Some people only chose one person and not 2 and 3. And again, they're coded by the 2 organizations. And one reason I like to do this is that when you have a network like this, it's very congested, lots of stuff, and you really can't see what's happening. I coded it particularly so you could see that they were still split. So I call this distilling the network, particularly when I do first, second, and third choices. I lived in Kentucky a while, and I thought, well, that's a good way to look at it. So I distilled the network down to a certain level of choices so that you can see what's happening, but you don't get all the clutter of everything. And then I run the sociogram again. So it doesn't match up to the first one as far as location, but I could do it that way and leave it by the first location. So what you're seeing here is this distilled network, only the first, second, and third choices, and you don't see all of the choices that are being made. And then in this network, I showed the mutual connections. And it's interesting because this shows absolutely no trust. It shows loyalty and very little trust. And most of the mutual connections are within the organization, the squares within the squares, the circles within the circles, and so on. Those that are mixed tend to have been long-term relationships, like between administrative assistants who worked with somebody in the other organization, so that it would be at the work at that level that the integration was taking place, and not like at the partner level or senior managers or associate managers. It was people who were doing computer work or having to create a document for everybody else. And so I like that sense of what you get as you filter down a network and what you learn from it. And this one is just two views and what you see with two views. Here you can see these key people who are leaders, and you can get a sense of what the overall network looks like. But when we did it this way with these underlying structural properties of mutual connections, you get a different picture. You get a little bit different idea of where the strength of the structure is holding together by mutual connections. So it gives you a little bit different perspective and allows you to ask questions about where the strength is and why it's like it is, and how could it change, and does it need to change, and why does the structure develop like that, particularly when you're using it as a developmental evaluation for an organization that which is what they were doing. They wanted to see how it worked out and what it looked like so that they could improve it. I have another one. Oh, that's yours.
So maybe we should answer some of these questions that have been in the chat pod.
Okay.
And Marianne, one of them is, let's see, how long does it take to get a sense of proficiency in developing SNA surveys and use of software and learning how to analyze it?
Well, I'm not going to speak for anybody else, but I spent 3 years reading all of the old literature, because when I started this, it was about 1988. And it was just coming into where you could buy UCINet and Crackplot and some of the tools. And I spent 3 years going back into the beginnings of the social science, some of the anthropology, the people who started this first, Moreno, reading his works. Freeman was writing a lot at the time about it, and looking at the early studies that had been done that led to graph theory, the studies on where the strength of a tie is, how the measures were beginning to be evolved, and so on. So I spent 3 years doing that and growing with the methodology as well, and learning what the algorithms were, because it is the algorithms that drive the measures. There is some theory in a network, so that we do have theories aligned to, for example, clicks, and what it means when you have a click, a theoretical framework for that. And why you might not use a click, you might use a different measure because of the theory of your organization. And there are theories behind each of the measures. So we have measures of degree and what that means. And we have Freeman's degree centrality. We have lots of centrality measures. There's over 12 centrality measures, maybe 14. and each of them is a different algorithm. One centrality measure is, for example, a count of the in and out degrees. Who picked you? Who did I pick? Another count is a measure of who you are between. So it takes every pair, or it takes every three, and am I between them? And so this whole algorithm, mathematical algorithm, goes through the network looking at three and how many are you between, as a betweenness measure, to get so that you are what connects two people. Because betweenness is a hidden leadership or a barrier. If you have high betweenness, you might be a barrier to where connections can't go any farther. Some of the other connections are based on other things like a path. Some are calculated on nodes. Some are calculated on the edges. So the proficiency level is not like quantitative. You know, I mean, if you understand the measure for doing regression or an ANOVA, you can pretty much figure out how to read the responses from the help manuals. It's, I find, more difficult with social network because it's so connected to the theory of your program, what you want to look at. And sometimes you can't set that up ahead of time. I always look at the whole network. What am I working with? How many components? How many in degree and out degree? Who's big in the network? And I may have some things I want to know about over time, but I also try to have a bigger picture. And that bigger picture often says we need to look at this. We need to look at this. What's happening here? And it sort of is an iterative process.
So, Marianne, another question was, if a network hinges on one individual?
I use UCINet almost exclusively. I do use NodeXL. NodeXL has some very nice graphics, but NodeXL provides tune mode data, and then you have to restructure that data. And also, NodeXL has now, you can't use it without a cost. It used to be free. Now they want you to buy it.
So, Marianne,
I see a question about a network hinges on a single node. They could be a good thing. They could be keeping the network alive, but they could also be a barrier. Now, if we look at this nodes here, that little yellow one out there, that yellow one is a leader. And so that yellow one is probably pretty strong and is connecting to the other yellow leaders, and they're just beginning their work in this sociogram. So I would say they are a strong leader, and they are connecting to other strong leaders. Like they're connecting to an orange one. See, so they're connecting to this orange one, and they're connecting down here to this red one. So in this case, they would be a strong leader because of the theory of the network. We're integrating strong leadership to build strong teams, and that looks like it's happening.
Well, we probably need to wrap up. It's 2 o'clock.
Do we have any other questions?
Susan, is there an evaluation for people to fill out?
Are we done with time, or are we still having a few minutes? Or am I talking to myself?
I think it's 2 o'clock.
I don't think Marianne can hear us.
Oh.
I'll type in the chat box. Scott, offhand, do you know the question to Mary Kevin Lucy's question is, are those software programs available for the Mac?
I'm fairly certain they are.
Action taken as a result of having the information. Well, this team took the information. They provided it to the whole group because they all were working on that. And they then saw where they needed to work harder, and they did. I'll tell another story. I had a group I worked with at Arthur Andersen, and he wanted to have an hourglass, and he wanted the partners at the top, the team to be a matrix in the center, and then he wanted the clients to be at the bottom. And when we did the sociogram, I'm like, I cannot get this hourglass look. And he looked at it and he said, oh, but it is an hourglass look. It just looks like a bullseye from the top because we couldn't get it to look like the hourglass. But he said it is what we want. It's the team in the center, tight, and around them are clients, all dispersed, all around the whole team that does different things with these clients. But not everybody's going to the same client, which is what we wanted. And then the partners are on the outer rim. They're being strategically used. So that was one study we did where they could show that the team who really wanted it to work, it did work. And the team that said it worked and were trying to convince them it worked, when we looked at theirs, it did not work. It was split off very much into unique clusters, all unseparated. Just imagine all of these off by themselves. That's what theirs look like. So people do use it. I find people sometimes want one answer, and you may not get one answer. You may get over time, yes, some measures, but you may not always get just one answer.
Okay, great. So, Rachel, do you know if this will jump straight to the survey when we X out, or people need to go to a link? For Mary.
I was just checking, and I'm not sure that we got the survey set up for this one. I apologize for that. I think that we will probably, if it pops up at the end, please take it, but I'm not sure we got it linked.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and these presentation materials will be available on the RRDC website. Is that correct? I think the site was posted earlier. Mary posted it up there to get an audio recording of this call, but we can also post a new presentation material. Thank you so much for joining today, and if you get an evaluation, please fill it out, and if you don't, then we'll see you next time. It should be 2 or 3 months. February 6th, I think that's the day.